Australia is not going to solve the problem of the Uyghurs. Australia is not going to solve the problem of Hong Kong. Australia is not going to solve the problem in the South China Sea. Those problems can only be resolved in the first instance by China itself.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasury.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and we're recording this on Tuesday, the 1st of September 2020. Australia has had a long relationship with China, with extensive trade between our two nations, strong relationships between our universities and scientific communities, including the scientists working on the response to COVID-19. But the relationship has turned decidedly rocky of late, with trade stoushes over Australian beef, barley and wine.
Australia's-China relations seem to be deteriorating by the day.
Australia's own relationship with China is also at one of its lowest points in nearly 50 years.
It really started to sour on April 19. The federal government calling for a global inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus outbreak, including China's initial response.
Making threats against Taiwan, launching cyber attacks, threatening trade sanctions and interfering in our democracy.
The following month, China imposes an 80% tariff on Australian barley and blacklists imports.
Mr Tudge has told the National Press Club today that some countries are trying to meddle with Australia's multicultural communities,
including foreign language media controlled or funded by state players.
Our international society is under strain.
Frankly, there are some shadows, I think, over here about our relationship. So we need to make our position much more clear in order to remove these shadows and let the sun shining our relationship.
But ultimately we need to find a way to have a productive relationship with China, one that contemplates our values and our interests, including our sovereignty, but also recognises the relationship is about real people, it's about jobs and exporters.
Australia's fractured relationship with China has just got worse. Australian journalist Cheng Lei has been arrested in China and could be detained for up to 6 months without access to legal aid.
And my guest today has said that it is stridency that distinguishes contemporary government pronouncements on China and Australia's relationship with China, rather than a considered and deliberate approach. So today I'm joined again by Allan Behm, head of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs program, to discuss how we got here, some of the very real problems that we must address, and how we navigate a path out to put Australia's relationship with China back on track. G'day, Allan.
Good afternoon, Ebony.
So, Allan, to begin with, how would you characterise the relationship between Australia and China at the moment?
Well, Ebony, it's in a pretty poor condition, actually. To the extent that we're talking past each other. There seems to be very little in the conversation that we can agree on at the moment. I think that we are sort of arguing over matters of principle without really understanding what those principles are. But the costs of the poor relationship at the moment really is to be found in our economic relationship, where we have a set of new barriers put up against our trading relationship, particularly with grain, beef and wine. And these are, I think, pretty serious consequences that do arise from a breakdown in the relationship itself.
There is a process there. We will provide whatever assistance we can. The family, I know, are working to try to provide legal advice and assistance as well, and we will give them whatever support we can as well.
And I will just touch briefly on the fact that it's in the last kind of 24 hours we've heard about an Australian journalist based in China, Cheng Lei, who has been detained by the Chinese authorities. How much of a concern is that, and do you think it's related to the tensions within the relationship at the moment?
It's very hard to tell whether it's related to the tensions in the relationship at the moment. She's quite a visible journalist in China. She works out of Beijing. She is a Chinese-born Australian citizen, which means that from a Chinese perspective, she is Chinese. From an Australian perspective, she is Australian. So quite properly, the government has signalled that it is very interested in her case, that it's looking for clarification as to why she has been detained. I can only speculate, Ebony, as to what the facts might be, because at this stage there is actually no information at all about what issues she might have been detained for. But my guess would be that she possibly has received information which reflects directly on the government of China, or perhaps on the Chinese Communist Party, or perhaps on the leadership of President Xi Jinping. And for those sorts of reasons, people are vulnerable to detention and arrest in China, where they wouldn't be in a country such as Australia or America. So quite properly, the government will be looking for consular access to this journalist, and will be seeking, as Simon Birmingham has said just today, to make sure that she is accorded appropriate legal representation in China, and that the charges do conform with the requirements of Chinese law.
And how much do you think that will be made difficult by the tensions, where we know for a fact that several Australian ministers have been unable to talk to their Chinese counterparts for many months now? Is that going to complicate things in a case such as this?
I don't think it will add complication to it, but equally it won't help resolve it quickly. I think what we will see is quite a formal process prosecuted by the Chinese government. I don't think that they will single her out for harsh treatment, but equally I don't think that they will be inclined to make the management of the process any easier than it might otherwise be.
So, Allan, we recently saw the Deputy Chief of Mission from the Chinese Embassy in Australia address the National Press Club in Canberra. What struck you about his remarks, and do they offer a way forward for the Australia-China relationship?
Well, Ebony, I don't really know what I expected when I went across to the press club and listened to Wang Xining. I thought that he might well have used the opportunity to beat up on Australia a bit in the same kind of way that the Australian government has been beating up on China. And so I was surprised that he took the high ground, really, and offered a way forward that was based on a set of principles which he enunciated around respect, goodwill, fairness and vision. Now, of course, diplomats can discuss what any of those four words mean until they go blue in the face, and they probably still won't agree even then as to what they're talking about. But putting that to one side, what the Deputy Chief of Mission did, I think, was to make a couple of offers. The first one was, let's start talking about the principles on which we want to have this relationship. And secondly, and this was quite interesting, in response to a question, he said something like, look, I don't know what instructions you are sending to your embassy in Beijing, but if you are having difficulty talking to Chinese ministerial counterparts, well, come down to the embassy here and we will help you do it.
And, it's under COVID-19, it's not possible to organize face-to-face exchange between leaders of countries and even senior ministers. But the diplomatic channels are always open. We have issues. I keep in contact with my counterpart. So are my colleague with other portfolio. The diplomatic are always channel. It is easy for us to talk about the issues. There's no block in between. Thank you.
And he would not have done that except under instruction. So I took that to be something of a circuit breaker, at least, which should enable the Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, to have some kind of dialogue with his counterpart in order to get to the bottom of these problems in the trading relationship.
We have seen, I think, the most visible example of the tensions within our trade relationship and within the arguments that we're having over beef, barley and wine, as you mentioned. But it kind of all kicked off, or it seems to me like it all kicked off at the beginning of the year with the pandemic and with Australia announcing, I think on Insiders, that it was going to push for that investigation into the origins of coronavirus. But had things been rocky before that, Allan?
Well, we've had ups and downs in the relationship with China virtually from the very beginning. But generally speaking, what Australia and China have managed to do is to maintain quite a high level of diplomatic equilibrium by having most of the discussions conducted between our diplomats, with the occasional very high-level visit of a minister to, as it were, put the top spin on it. I have actually accompanied Australian ministers. I've accompanied an Australian Prime Minister to China and certainly defence ministers. And always those meetings were conducted professionally and with a good deal of bonhomie, to be quite frank. What has tended to happen in the last few years, and this largely follows the visit of President Xi in 2014, we've had a series of sort of stumbles and mishaps. You might recall that Prime Minister Turnbull decided that it would be a good thing to quote Chairman Mao in a speech that he gave, and he in fact quoted something which it is believed Chairman Mao never said. And that sort of trip into speaking Mandarin didn't work so well, and some people in China took umbrage at that. And as we've gone further on, we've had these niggles in the relationship, most of them attaching to problems in Hong Kong, the problems of the Uyghur minority in Western China, and of course the interest that the United States has in testing freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. So those three issues, which are political and strategic issues, have come together to cloud the economic relationship, where it might have been in the interests of both sides to maintain a high level of separation between the two. So what we've seen is this sort of spiralling into a set of challenges between Beijing and Canberra that have sort of got egos involved. And always, when egos get involved, there is going to be sparks, and there almost certainly will be some fireworks. We've had this in other relationships. Some of the people listening to us today might recall the very tense time that we had back in the 80s with President Suharto in Indonesia. We've had testing times with Prime Minister Mahathir, with Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. We've had testing times even between Australia and New Zealand, actually. And all of these tended to relate to, chest thumping and people sort of allowing their egos to run away with them a bit. Were we to take the ego out of it and get back to the conduct of business, I rather suspect that it would be a relationship with a lot less heat in it, and perhaps with a measure more diplomacy and professionalism.
And what is on the line for Australia with the rocky relationship? How closely intertwined are we with China, and how important is it to Australia's future?
Look, I think we have quite deep relationships with China. Myself, my relationships with China go back to 1982, and in the intervening years, I visited China quite a number of times, normally in support of a minister, and occasionally to conduct bilateral talks on defence and security matters. And I've always found those to be completely professional. We still conduct security talks between Australia and China, and I think they're very important things to do just to make sure that there's no misunderstanding. But where we are at the moment, I think, is that the overarching politics of the relationship are somewhat clouding the business of the relationship. I'm not the only person to identify that. A number of the commentators, but most particularly coming out of the Sydney business community, have been saying that, we need to step back from the politics and focus on the business. Twiggy Forrest obviously being one of those. So it would seem to me that we've come to a point where it would be a very good idea were we to be much more nuanced and much quieter in the way in which we advance our positions. If we look at our neighbours, for example, and I would here single out Singapore, Singapore has been very clever in being able to maintain an equable relationship with China, notwithstanding the fact that it has almost all of the same problems in relationship management that Australia has. The difference, though, I think, is that the Prime Minister of Singapore and Singapore's Foreign Minister are both able to take a much more relaxed, a much more constructive approach to dealing with those relationships, and are less inclined to reach for the megaphone and to play into domestic audiences.
So I guess you're talking there about the need for much better diplomacy, but recognising the very real issues that Australia does have, and you've touched on a few of them, including, the treatment of the Uyghur minorities, amongst other things, Hong Kong included. But in terms of the importance of diplomacy and getting things back on track in that respect, what will that help Australia do when it comes to resolving those problems that we're always going to have with, a regime like China? Look,
Australia is not going to solve the problem of the Uyghurs. Australia is not going to solve the problem of Hong Kong. Australia is not going to solve the problem in the South China Sea. Those problems can only be resolved in the first instance by China itself, talking to its immediate neighbours, that is the other claimants in the South China Sea, and being able to work out a way forward in Hong Kong, which at the very least garners the support of a majority of Hong Kong citizens. Now, there's been a lot of foreign interference in Hong Kong from a lot of different parties, I think. It is fair to recall that under British administration there was no parliament. It was just a colony administered by the British government. And the arrival of a legislative assembly in Hong Kong came really quite late. So we just have to be careful here that we don't read too much into the modern history of Hong Kong, and that we do recognise that it is Australia's policy, as it is Britain's, that there is one China, and as a result of a one China policy, ultimately it is for the government of China to work out how best to administer itself. We like to sort of, as we say, draw lines in the sand. We are portraying the current difficulties, at least in some of the media commentary, as being a contest between our values, which we feel that we must stand up for, or, on the other hand, kowtowing to China and simply appeasing China's demands. I tend to think that that is a totally erroneous analysis, and it's an erroneous way of thinking about it. It's not, I think, the case that we are actually standing up for principles, and it certainly isn't the case that we're appeasing China if in some respects we accommodate to the things that China says that it wants and that we, in some circumstances, may be able to give. So in all of this, we're much better advised to approach our relationship with China on the basis of a carefully crafted diplomacy, one that talks frankly and clearly to China, expressing what our interests are, listening carefully to what China says back to us, not conceding on those important things that matter to Australia, like our ability to conduct our political life without foreign interference, our ability to run our universities without having Chinese students razzed up to tell the university what it is allowed to say and, even more importantly, what it's not allowed to say. We can't have the abuse of facilities within universities, such as the Confucius Institutes, being used as an arm of the government of China. Of course, we've got to stand up on those things. But equally, we've got to be careful about the signals we're giving, not just to China, but to our own ethnic Chinese community, many of whom are confused by the sabre rattling that they think they can hear, and which I think is actually around, when what we need to be doing is to ensure that whatever the quality of our relationship with China, our citizens who were born in China feel that they are respected, that they're included, that they're valued, and that any tension that might be in our relationship with China does not reflect on them. I think it's a very important part of the current problem.
Yeah, and certainly in the past it hasn't taken much to whip up anti-Asian sentiment within the community in decades past, and we wouldn't want to go back to that, I imagine. But I did want to touch briefly on almost, I think, the day after the Deputy Chief of Mission addressed the National Press Club and, as you said, kind of offered a circuit breaker in that speech. We saw the government flag that is going to introduce a foreign relations bill. Ostensibly, it looked like to be able to strike down agreements such as the one that the Victorian government has as part of the Belt and Road Initiative with China.
The Foreign Minister would have the power to rip up deals between state and foreign governments under proposed new federal laws being revealed today.
Let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. Now,
Victorian government angered Canberra 2 years ago when it negotiated an understanding with China to participate in its controversial Belt and Road Initiative.
China just plays us off a break. It says, all right, we forget about Canberra, we'll try and pick off a state.
The rules would also cover agreements with councils, universities and foreign governments.
Now, Scott Morrison's government's planning to firmly retake sole control of foreign policy.
What's your impression of what we know so far about the Foreign Relations Bill?
Well, I think my impression is that what we know so far is that we don't know anything so far. The government has not put a bill on the table. We don't know the extent of the Commonwealth's ambition with respect to particular relationships that state governments or local governments or public universities might wish to enter into with China. We don't know how they're thinking about arrangements that have already been negotiated and, dare I say it, Ebony, paid for. We don't know whether all of the agreements that operate between Australian institutions and Chinese counterpart institutions, and I'm led to believe there are over 10,000 of those, whether they're all up for grabs, as it were, and that they're all going to be now reviewed by some super board of people who are going to decide whether or not they conform to Australia's national interest, whatever that happens to be. And you've got to remember that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have yet to say precisely what they're seeking to do here. The Prime Minister has said words around, protecting Australia's national interests and having whatever the states do conform to foreign policy prescriptions, but without saying what any of those are. And I think that there are certain difficulties in the way of that. And I think that the timing of it, coming as it did last Thursday, is not accidental. I don't think it had anything at all, actually, to do with the Deputy Chief of Mission's speech at the Press Club. I think it had much more to do with the politics of the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Premier of the state of Victoria. And I do think that it was the Prime Minister saying to Daniel Andrews, look, sport, you might think you're able to close the borders and lock down Melbourne, but I'll tell you what you can't do. You can't negotiate with China. Well, Yes, he can, actually. And that was the point that was made by the former Premier of Western Australia, Colin Barnett, just last night on Q&A.
I mean, this is complete overkill and totally unnecessary, and in my view, just simply will not work. Western Australia, other states will continue to develop their economic policy. They'll continue to do arrangements with other countries. And one thing that's forgotten, this is not the states getting involved in foreign policy. If you're talking about, for example, mineral resources, the state is the owner. It's got a governance role and it's also got a commercial role in getting a good return for the people of each state and the country as a whole. Right now, one of the things we should be doing is toning down this bickering with China. It's doing Australia and Australians' confidence a lot of damage.
And the final point on this little sequence, Ebony, that I should mention is the land bridge negotiation in Darwin. That is the agreement that was reached some 5 years or so now ago to lease the Port of Darwin for a period of 99 years for $504 million. My understanding is that money has been paid and the contract entered into. So to break that contract at the behest of the Commonwealth Government would, I think, be seen as a real representation of sovereign risk, and I think it will need to be thought through extremely carefully because there's a whole lot of reputational damage that could flow from that might relate to a whole set of other negotiations that we might want to enter into or that Australian entities might want to enter into, which maybe their interlocutors will no longer be prepared to do.
I guess I wanted to finish up with the path forward. So recently, in the last couple of months, we saw the Foreign Affairs Minister and the Defence Minister travel all the way to the United States for the AUSMIN talks mid-pandemic. Are we putting similar efforts into any other bilateral relationship? And what can we do now to get our relationship with China back on track, in your opinion?
Well, I certainly can't see that we're making anything like the investment in any other relationship to compare with the investment that we've recently made in the relationship with the United States. I mean, that was very dramatic and theatrical to have two ministers and two secretaries and the chief of the Defence Force and a few others sort of go across the Pacific for a couple of hours of meetings, come back and then spend 2 weeks in quarantine. It's a very big investment of governmental, ministerial and diplomatic time. I would like to think that we could invest something like that in improving our relationship with China or improving our relationship with Indonesia for that matter, or maybe even with New Zealand. I think the important point to plan out a way forward is to go back to what is standard diplomatic practice, to be clear about your objectives, to be able to enunciate them clearly and properly, to be able to do so calmly, without chest thumping and sabre rattling and accusation. If you're going to have a really good idea, like let's find out where the coronavirus came from, then at the very least start off by saying to China, hey, are you interested in where the coronavirus came from? Are you interested in being able to tell everybody how you managed it? And are you interested in being able to cooperate with everyone else and preventing it from happening again? I can't imagine for a moment that China would say no to any of those questions. But when you go on to morning television on a Sunday morning and suddenly pour a bucket over the World Health Organization, exclude it from consideration to an independent international inquiry, and make it look as though the rest of the world is going to burst aboard China, go down to Wuhan, and then find out what happened, is a very great stretch of the imagination, I think. That could have been handled very, very much more smoothly. And indeed, that's what the Europeans did when they got hold of the same idea. And of course, China came aboard because the investigation will be led by the WHO, which China is a member of and which China supports, and it will have the participation of scientists from around the world. Why on earth couldn't we have said that?
It's a very good point, Alan.
I just think that we do have an opportunity now to look at a much more professional way of managing this relationship. And I think what I'd like to see is for the Minister for Foreign Affairs to make some arrangement to go and visit her counterpart in Beijing. She was able to visit her counterpart, Mr. Pompeo, in Washington, and then perhaps for that to be a preliminary to the Prime Minister returning President Xi's visit sometime in the course of the next year or so. We should be thinking of both sides trying to get back onto the high ground.
And we might have to wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Alan.
Not at all.
This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned. You can check out the Australia Institute's Economics of a Pandemic webinar series at our website, tai.org.au/webinars. And the next event is on Wednesday, the 2nd of September, with former President of Timor-Leste and Nobel Prize laureate Jose Ramos Horta and former ACT Attorney General and Barrister Bernard Collaery on East Timor, oil and secret prosecutions. Don't miss out. It's free, but registration is essential. For the latest health information, you can check health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent Coronacast podcast, which comes out daily. You can visit tai.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a ~NTT, and Allan Behm is at Miranda Process. That's PRORSUS. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macey, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum. Keep washing those hands, stay 1.5 metres away, wear a mask, stay safe, and thanks for listening, everyone.